reminder, this is another guest lecture in the energy conscious construction courses that are being developed right now, and many of which are published through the summer. So if you're looking to up your education game and get a certificate in energy conscious construction, those classes are now available, and this lecture is a part of this series. Today, we're going to talk with Phil Gruen about modernism. A little background on Phil. Phil Gruen is an associate professor in the School of Design and Construction here at WSU. His research broadly regards the architecture and urbanism of the United States, which highlights the importance of interpretation and regularly questions dominant narratives by recognizing marginalized and underrepresented built environments, including those of everyday and the ordinary. He teaches courses in modern architecture, historic preservation, a course in the Honors College about the Palouse, and a graduate course in the SEC called Discrimination and Design. He knows what he's talking about. Gruen received his bachelor's in art and history and criticism at the University of California and at San Diego, where he spent 2 years living in 2 different big, brutal, modern concrete high-rises built in the 1960s. He then received his master's in the history of architecture and the art at the University of Illinois at Chicago, the entire campus of which was planned and built as a brutal concrete environment inspired by a nearby expressway interchange in the 1960s. Then he attained his PhD in architecture at the University of California at Berkeley, where the College of Environmental Design is housed in Worcester, another, you guessed it, modern concrete brutal monster built in the 1960s. And he loved all of these modern buildings, campuses, and residence halls. Given this experience, Gruen is qualified to deliver tonight's talk called Save It, Modernism, Preservation, and Government. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Phil Gruen.
Thank you, Magnus, and thank you all for coming here today. I want to begin with a couple of disclaimers. The first is that I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a politician, I'm not a planner, I'm not really a climate expert, I'm an historian. So if you ask me any real technical questions about carbon capture, about greenhouse gases, about the exact amounts of carbon emitted by particular materials or processes, about cap and trade, about specifics, about bills eliminating zoning for single-family housing, which are moving their way through the state legislature as we speak, I'm probably not the best person to ask. But I also know that we are in a climate crisis and a housing crisis, and we have been for some time. I'm also a faculty member here in the School of Design and Construction, so I think it's important to consistently think about how we, as educators, as students, can contribute to the discussion or the solution. I think we can. Now, the other disclaimer is that much of what I'm discussing, others have already written about, or they've said. So I can't really claim that my ideas are particularly new or innovative. And that's perfectly okay with me. I think we all need to be reminded of some good ideas that have been around for a while. Now, on the other hand, if I am introducing something new to many of you, that's also good. Consider this good preparation for a number of issues that are landing on the desks of many professional design and construction offices or that already have. If you end up going into the world of design and construction, or if you're already in it, or if you're just interested in the built environment, in your physical environment, or in maintaining some sense of the past, you won't be surprised if you're asked to work on existing buildings or to consider the issues of historic preservation in the process of design and construction. And maybe the buildings you'll be asked to consider preserving or saving will be like these. Magnus just talked about them in the introduction. Modernist, brutalist buildings that we tend to disregard. Now, these particular buildings, they're not under any immediate threat of going away as far as I know, but someday they might be. Will we want to save them? Again, these are buildings I've spent a lot of time in. The slide on the left, a couple of years of living in those towers. Now, when we think of historic preservation, especially in the United States or even in the Pacific Northwest, we generally think of older stone, brick, or wooden buildings such as these, built around the turn of the 20th century. Nothing wrong with preserving buildings like these, of course, but why does it always seem to be buildings like these? Buildings with traditional materials, styles of the Western tradition with which we are familiar, the classical, the Romanesque. And why do we often seem to favor one period of history over another? I want us to think about saving the built environment, perhaps of a more recent period of design, that of the decades following World War II. Now, things are certainly changing out there in the world of preservation, but historically, we've ignored this period, and especially the big concrete examples of architectural modernism. We keep saying we must do everything we can in the world of design and construction to reverse the climate crisis. But are we willing to save buildings like these? And by the way, I'm using some terms interchangeably this evening: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, reconstruction, as well as renovation, regeneration, retrofitting, adaptive reuse, and save. I know most of these terms have different meanings. They break down into some very specific details when it comes to trying to ensure that a building's preservation meets various criteria for national or local historic registers. But I don't want this to be an exercise where we go through each of the terms and discuss what constitutes what. It would feel like we're attending a workshop, and you can look some of these up by going to the Secretary of the Interior's Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties under the National Park Service, and you'll probably need to at some point if you're doing any sort of work on a building or a landscape that might be considered historic. I just want us to think about what we choose to preserve and whether we might consider preserving or saving something that we tend to dismiss, such as modern, mostly concrete, multi-story residential buildings. And I want to talk about saving modernism in the spirit of various design manifestos. Over time, those manifestos that attempt to declare new movements by sheer rhetoric and repetition and short, choppy sentences, perhaps so they stick in your mind. So, without further ado, number one, given our climate crisis, our first response about every building we think that should be demolished should be, can we save it? Number two, if the building is what we consider an example of modernism, our first question should be, can we save it? If the building is what we consider ugly, the first question should be, can we save it? I think you're probably catching a theme here. If the building is or was residential, that means that people are either living in the building or once did. Can we save it? And that's it. That's my Save It manifesto. Now, as you can see, it's a series of questions, or really it's the same question over and over and over. But if we want to save a building, why am I bothering with modernist housing? What we see here is the kind of built environment famous for its destruction, right? Wasn't it architectural modernism which exacerbated the inequities of race and class? Wasn't it this stripped down, bare bones concrete modern architecture planning and high-speed expressways that facilitated the movement of money and people out of the inner cities to the suburbs, at least in the post-war United States? These high-rise housing developments were supposed to be our solutions to all sorts of issues, social, cultural, environmental. They supposedly cleaned up older, dilapidated neighborhoods, which were demolished, and provided new, efficient, technologically up-to-date housing. And they did this for a time. Many of them did become characterized and stigmatized by other issues, crime, drugs, gangs, and other sorts of illicit activities, not all of which could be attributed to the architecture or the landscape. And they became scapegoats for all that was wrong with modern architecture: technocratic, impersonal, desolate, destructive. Now, these particular developments, the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago and many others like them all over the country, have also been demolished. But now I'm asking you to consider saving buildings like these. Now, I'm not necessarily one of these people, nor am I asking you to be. That is, people who picket the demolition of buildings. It's not a lot of people like this, but there are some. People willing to throw themselves in front of a bulldozer to save the built environment, no matter what it looks like. This is the famous protest against the destruction of Penn Station in New York in the early 1960s, which was part of a galvanizing movement that led to a landmarks law in the city of New York and likely influenced the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. But you see one of the picket signs there on the left: "Save our heritage." Whose heritage? Too often that heritage is that of an exclusive clientele. People here are protesting in suits and white gloves. Even Jane Jacobs. Now, they may have had a reason to do so, but historically, and still today, preservationists rally to save old buildings that were part of a mostly well-off, predominantly white history. And that's certainly not everyone's history or heritage. Either way, I do want us to consider saving a building or a landscape first before rushing to knock it down. Doesn't matter what it looks like, or at least saving some of it, even if we have to update it, change it, adaptively reuse it, because once it's gone, it's gone. And we've wasted a tremendous amount of energy in the process. We're faced with rapid climate change, a lack of adequate housing, and we simply can't afford to immediately write off or demolish any part of our built environment because of how we react to a building's aesthetics, or how we choose to interpret its past. Robin Hood Gardens in London, which you see here, has long been considered a kind of aesthetic blight. Why are we so quick to criticize modern buildings or any existing building or building type or style, while forgetting that they could be prime candidates for adaptive reuse, that they can be made energy efficient, that perhaps they can actually help the climate and housing crisis, and that by saving them, they might even help with social justice and equity and inclusion? Everyone should have access to decent housing, or at least everyone should have access to their own histories and memories. And we should all be thinking carefully about whose and what memories we are destroying when we opt to destroy a physical building. Here we see photos of people at Robin Hood Gardens over time. Do we know their thoughts about this place? Did they see it as a concrete monstrosity? Did they want it torn down? Did they want to move? Now, I also think, as students, designers, critics, historians, preservationists, just people interested in the built environment, that we can be a part of the change we wish to see, even if we assume that we have little influence and that it's the clients or the owners who have all the power, developers, industrialists, the government. And designing and building is just a service profession, and we need to be obedient in order to gain the commission. Why can't it also be about advocacy and education? Why can't we inform others? So the first point of the Save It Manifesto. Given our climate crisis, our first question about every building we think should be demolished should be, can we save it? Now, the idea of saving rather than demolishing buildings relates to a broad history and a broad theory of historic preservation that has been around since the 1970s, at least since the poster that you see there on the right-hand side was produced for a National Trust for Historic Preservation conference. What it says there below the building/gas can, it says, it takes energy to construct a new building. It saves energy to preserve an old one. And then on the left, another more updated phrase, the greenest building is the one already built. That one sponsored by the AIA. Existing buildings, this is essentially saying, are the most sustainable buildings of all. Now, as preservation theorist and architectural historian Max Page has written, preservation of existing buildings is not simply a gesture, but the centerpiece of the world's efforts to slow and ultimately reverse climate change. Historic preservation is at the center of reversing climate change. Wow. Let's think about this in terms of energy-conscious construction. Let's consider that it means the most carbon-neutral thing that you could possibly do is no construction at all. In other words, an existing building has all the embodied carbon already captured inside of it. So if you just reuse the building, you conserve the energy embodied in its materials. In fact, it's believed that if you build a new super energy conscious building, the kind we learn about and are inspired by justifiably all the time, it can take that building up to as many as 80 years to recoup the carbon debt that was incurred from its initial construction. And the initial construction also includes the demolition of an existing building on the site. So, don't automatically knock something down and build something new, because no matter what you do, no matter what you build, you're going to expend more energy, you're going to waste more resources in knocking down the existing building and then constructing something anew. It doesn't matter if you're planning to recycle every bit of the existing building and replace it, again, with the most energy-conscious new building imaginable. A building filled with solar panels, with harvested materials from Forest Stewardship Council, that is FSC certified wood, with wind turbines inserted between the floors spinning sideways, a rain garden on the roof, bioswales, permeable pavement. Look, all of that, that's great. Super. Why not put those elements into an existing building? Don't knock it down. Now here's a graphic that tries to explain this a little bit. This is from 2018, so a few years old. Represents energy incurred from either constructing a new commercial building or renovating an existing one in Portland. Now what you see here, the blue line on the left, the blue line represents the new building, which of course, again, it includes the destruction of the existing building on site. The orange line below it, much lower down, represents the existing building. And what this essentially shows is that if you build a new building, you incur a tremendous amount of energy, of carbon. You release a tremendous amount of carbon, is what the graph is showing at the very beginning when you knock down the existing building and then construct the new one, no matter, again, its new energy-saving features. If you renovate or adaptively reuse the existing building, yes, you use some energy in that process, to be sure, but not nearly as much. For the most part, according to this graph, for a commercial building in Portland, one of the greenest cities on the planet, so they say, it takes 42 years, that's where that green dot there in the center marks, 42 years before new buildings, new energy-conscious buildings, will have the same impact on climate change as the existing building. Now, granted, the process of new construction as well as demolition is getting less energy intensive over time. We're getting better at that. But still, it is not as green or sustainable as keeping the existing building. Not even close. Why aren't we learning from existing buildings? Have we forgotten that in the world before the Industrial Revolution, before intense fossil fuel extraction, before the Anthropocene, we were always building in green, sustainable ways for thousands of years because it was simply logical to do so, or because there was no other way to build. We had the materials that we had: timber, mud brick, stone. Vitruvius wrote about sustainability. He didn't call it that. In the very first known architectural manifesto of the Western world, the 10 books on architecture. And he discussed the importance of paying attention to the natural environment. He stressed the need for architects, engineers, and builders to use locally found materials and sturdy, lasting ones so that they could avoid the constant repairs that otherwise created more waste and more resources. And he wrote about maximizing natural light, oriented buildings to the south to capture as much daylight as possible, creating large windows or skylights to allow light to penetrate inside, as well as using reflective surfaces to distribute light throughout the interiors. Vitruvius also recommended open-air atria, which not only brought in light, but also ventilation, fresh air. And we can see that in the partly reconstructed House of Sallust in Pompeii on the right, obviously for a very wealthy individual. It just happens to be one of our better surviving examples. Or we could look closer to home, to examples of indigenous peoples of this continent. For hundreds, even thousands of years that they've been using naturally occurring materials, and some of their buildings are still standing. We could look to adobe construction in the American Southwest, for example. Adobe is a phenomenal green kind of material. It somehow works both ways. That is, it can help keep a house cool in the summer. It absorbs winter light in the winter and helps warm it at that time. It doesn't need a lot of maintenance. We're looking at the quite remarkable Taos Pueblo in Taos, New Mexico here, which is still a very much lived-in complex. You don't see any people in this photograph. When I took it, I was not wanting to intrude, but there's a dog that I just noticed in the center that was not particularly pleased with me standing there for the photograph. This is now perhaps going on 1,000 years old. And then we have timber construction, of course. Even earlier forms of mass timber, you can see the enormous timber beams there coming through, holding up the roof. Here in the Pacific Northwest. Now, of course, wood, this is susceptible to fire, to rot, so not all wooden buildings have lasted, especially those with exposed wood. This isn't around anymore. But in terms of inspiration for a sustainable material, even with composites that are glued or laminated, and for constructing buildings in green ways, we could look to places such as this. This is Chief Weah's house in Masset in Haida Gwaii, former Queen Charlotte Islands in British Columbia. Like many indigenous buildings of the coastal Northwest, it uses red cedar. This wood, as the Haida artist Bill Reed put it in the 1970s, is permeated with natural oils that make it one of the longest lasting of all woods, even in the damp of the Northwest coast climate. You can build from the cedar tree, he said, the exterior trapping of one of the world's greatest cultures. Now, one should be careful not to over-romanticize or appropriate the architecture of indigenous peoples. But we could certainly learn a thing or two about materials and ways to build from those who have been overrun, decimated, and colonized by allegedly more sophisticated peoples, technologies, and machinery. Now, I do understand the problems. We can't just take every existing building and save it or reuse it. We can't just automatically assume that the greenest building is the one that has always existed if that building for years has been spewing toxic chemicals, contributing to erosion, causing cancer, destroying the environment in other ways, contributing to racial and ethnic strife, or through its repetition has created alienation and a loss of self. We can't just save everything if we can't afford to save it, or if we've run the current numbers and it just doesn't seem to make sense for one reason or another. But I ask you again, can the first question be, at least, can we save it? If the building is an example of architectural modernism, this question becomes a bit of a tough sell. So, point 2 of my Save It manifesto. If the building is what we consider an example of modernism, our first question should be, can we save it? Now, when we look at a building like this is the Grenfell Tower, a housing complex for low-income residents in London in the 1970s. We often immediately wonder why anyone would have ever built something like it, unless they were so completely unimaginative, didn't care about aesthetics, or maybe it was just the cheapest solution at one time to pack in as many people as possible. And then we might wonder, why on earth is this building still there? Or maybe it's not, or it doesn't look like it once did. This is the same Grenfell Tower in 2017. It was an absolute tragedy. Some 72 people died in this fire. Now, the investigation is still ongoing, but the spread of the fire was apparently not believed to be caused by the original building, but rather by a 2016 renovation of the exterior, where an aluminum composite rain screen cladding was put on to improve the tower's aesthetics. This cladding, meanwhile, included a type of insulation that was intended to improve thermal comfort and thus energy efficiency. It was also highly flammable. Oddly, if they had just left the building alone, standing there in all of its modernist glory, that might never have happened. We need always to be careful about how we make our buildings energy conscious. Certainly whether aesthetics are a good reason to renovate them. Now, not everyone automatically despises modern architecture or modern housing. Some people are quite fond of it, in fact. There's an entire organization, it's been around for some time, that is dedicated to the preservation of modernism. It has the wonderful acronym DOCO-MOMO, which I have to look up every time when I try to figure out what that actually stands for. It stands for the Documentation and Conservation of Building Sites and Neighborhoods of the Modern Movement. But for the most part, we still don't seem to trust modern architecture. And it takes a lot to convince the public, developers, government officials, and whoever else that any of it, save for a small handful of buildings designed by extraordinarily well-known and famous designers, might be worth saving. Meanwhile, it's not difficult to convince most people that an old courthouse with classical columns, a quaint wooden Victorian home, a brick flour mill, an old weathered barn is worth saving. Those appeal perhaps more to our aesthetic sense and to our sense of the past, our sense of history, in part because they're older. Maybe it will take projects such as these to bring awareness that we should save architectural modernism. Here, the designers Anne Lacaton and Jean-Philippe Vassal took these housing projects that you see there on the left in Bordeaux, France, and then they completed an adaptive reuse project, which you see on the right of those same buildings. They gained some acclaim for it. Then they won the Pritzker Prize last year. This is the highest prize, or thought to be anyway, in architecture. This team, Lacaton and Vassal, has long specialized in adaptive reuse. But it might have been this particular project that pushed them over the top. So what did they do? Old building on the left, renovation on the right. They took a completely mundane, modernist housing block that most of us would barely take a second look at. Even the pastels that were painted on at some point might make little difference. They might have made it worse. And they didn't do all that much to it. But they did just enough. The first thing that they asked was, can we save it? Now, they did add some crucial aspects of light, health. They popped out balconies everywhere and new windows. And they apparently saved a great deal of money that would have been incurred if they had recommended demolition and then a new building. But importantly, they also created a socially uplifting set of spaces for existing buildings in a poor neighborhood on the edges of Bordeaux. And they gave people the dignity that they deserved and had deserved for years. Demolition, Lacaton and Vassal, the architects, have said, demolition is an act of violence. Demolition is an act of violence. That the Pritzker jury, who gave them the award, found this project and others that they had done worthy of the highest prize in architecture, might tell us something about our changing values, what really matters. Now, it's certainly about energy-conscious construction as they look to save an existing building. But in doing so, they also permitted people to remain in the place that they called home, where they had so many memories. And they did this quite literally, in fact. The renovation project proceeded in such a way that all of the residents were able to remain in their units while the construction and reconstruction was going on around them. Moving them out would have been entirely disruptive to many of the poor people who lived here. So this was also about social justice. I'd like to think that the design and construction industry is moving in this direction. We can't necessarily solve climate change and all of its political manifestations, but perhaps we can advocate for or design or redesign something like this. Now, here's another reason for us to consider modernist housing developments as candidates for saving and adaptive reuse. It's easy to denigrate architectural modernism, but we might consider that some modernist buildings, when they were built, were trying to be environmentally sound, and that some designers were trying to use new innovations in technology, mechanical systems, design theory, to make the environment better, or at least more comfortable and efficient. For example, the streets in the sky concept at Park Hill in Sheffield, these outdoor walkways. You see an older photo on the left, and after it was renovated there on the right, very much like we just saw the balconies in the apartments in Bordeaux. This was an attempt to provide outdoor gathering spaces, communal spaces, social linkages for the residents. And they apparently worked pretty well for some years, but they became problematic over time when they weren't maintained largely. Now, to be sure, some of the materials and systems at Park Hill, they had become outdated. All of the concrete you see here, not the most climate-friendly material, let alone not the most colorful. So there was some renovation that was necessary, which included improved insulation, triple glazed windows, solar panels, and a lot more color. And you see that on the views on the right. There were also a number of improvements to the surroundings, green spaces, public spaces, but recognizing that there was an attempt originally to make things environmentally sound or socially inclusive requires a willingness to try to understand the past from the perspective of those who were around at that time, if that's possible. Otherwise, we could be guilty of what historians call presentism, that is, placing our values from today upon those of the past. And it's the classic case of blaming our grandparents, for example, for their outdated and often culturally insensitive viewpoints. Though perhaps that's all they knew. Now, it doesn't mean they're right. Doesn't mean that they shouldn't change. But it does mean that we might at least take that into account. We might think right now, in this room, in this society, in this world, that we're all doing the absolute right things that we need to be doing for whatever reason, right now. What will they think of us in 50 years? What will we think of us in 50 years, 100 years? What I'm talking about with this point of the manifesto is really just a reminder that many buildings that we consider modernist, and perhaps those we look down upon today for their ecological and environmental failures, were considered thoroughly up to date when they were built. And the innovations in advanced mechanical systems in general, prefabrication, precast concrete panels, air conditioning, you name it, they were considered to provide the ultimate in human comfort. Perhaps they were even envisioned as a great way to save the environment because we wouldn't have to extract natural resources, at least not directly to heat or cool our buildings. And because so many architects actually designed with mechanical systems and new technologies in mind. And in the case of this particular reinforced concrete low-income housing development in Seattle, there was also an environmental consideration. Though some older houses were removed to build this, that wasn't environmental. Some existing chestnut and maple trees on the site were carefully maintained. To reiterate this point, it's a matter of being willing to look into the history of these buildings, to take the time to recognize why and when and in what context anything was built. It's simply not accurate to assume that people in the past were absolutely clueless and knowingly designed environmentally destructive, carbon-emitting buildings. I mean, sure, some of these buildings were relatively easy to assemble. Energy was plentiful and cheap in some cases. But folks did not necessarily understand or think always about their destructive properties in that way. In many cases, they really were thinking through what might be best for the environment and for society at that time. Another view of Park Hill we're looking at here. Now you can really see why they call these the streets in the sky. These walkways connecting to balconies. Nobody called these beautiful, not then perhaps, not even now. But they certainly were part of a larger social and collective vision. Which leads to the third point of the Save It Manifesto. If the building is what we consider ugly, the first question should be, can we save it? Now, this is probably the most difficult part of the manifesto to declare, because we all know how subjective the question of architectural or design aesthetics is, and everyone has a different definition. It's one of those, we know it when we see it. I tried to pick something that we might all agree is absolutely hideous. A big post-war reinforced concrete building in Seattle. This too, like we saw in Bordeaux, tried to soften the hard modernism with some relatively recent pastel painting on the exterior. And again, they probably made it worse. Or maybe we could look again at Robin Hood Gardens in London, often referred to as a brutalist building, and that term tossed around almost as another reason to demolish it. This is problematic, Brutalism is a complicated term. It's an ideology as much as an aesthetic style. But very few people try to understand brutalism as anything more than just a style. And in any event, most folks have a very difficult time separating aesthetics from ideas when it comes to something that strikes so viscerally at their tastes. Understanding a building's history or its theoretical underpinnings doesn't necessarily mean that they should be saved. You can't live inside a set of ideas if the buildings are unlivable. But Robin Hood Gardens wasn't unlivable when they knocked it down. And story after story has revealed that the building was actually quite well loved, but it was too late. What sorts of stories, attributes, innovations did Robin Hood Gardens have? Why was it built? For whom? And are the problems we might imagine here really about the design, or are they about upkeep or funding, or about something else such as discrimination? Do or did people actually enjoy living here? Can we save a part of it at least? Maybe we can make a few adjustments in the design to bring it up to current day standards. Apparently a little piece of this is still there. I think it's a shame when architects, preservationists, public officials, consultants, even journalists who have a tremendous amount of power in shaping public opinion don't do this work, don't do this research, since we could easily miss out on saving a building that really was quite extraordinary for one reason or another, really was quite innovative, or had become home to many people. I think we need to be aware of the idea that just because something doesn't appeal to our taste, especially in design school, necessarily means that everyone else sees it the way that we do, let alone the residents of the buildings that we study or that we use as precedents for one reason or another. Look, I can't stop you from seeing modern buildings as ugly. That's not my intent. This is McAllister Hall. It was a residence hall at WSU. It was over by Krugel and Gannon Goldsworthy for many years. It was demolished in 2015. The Save It manifesto isn't about trying to change your aesthetic tastes, as if that was even possible. It's about trying to get you to slow down after your initial reaction. Do some investigation. Do some research. We don't have to save the buildings as is. Usually we can't do that. A lot of these buildings have massive problems with mechanical, electrical, plumbing, MEP, a lot of other problems as well. But demolition shouldn't always be the first answer. Which brings me to the fourth and the final point in the Save It manifesto. If the building is or was residential, that means people are either living in the building or once did. Can we save it? Let's stay back home here at WSU for this example. This is Regents Hill. It's actually a few interconnected buildings built in 1952, designed by an architect named Paul Theory. It's an all-women's dormitory that is now over 70 years old. Won some awards when it was first built. It was fully in line with all sorts of experimental, modernist ideas that were emerging out of Europe in the early part of the 20th century. The sun porches that you see there on the exterior, they were all about a kind of early 20th century sustainability, about health and air and light. I don't know how often they're used, especially this spring term. On the interior, the tour de force, perhaps, the spiral staircase there in a period photograph from the 1950s, shortly after it was completed. Meanwhile, if you move through Regents Hall or Hill, there are a surprising number of moments, many of them curving walls in this otherwise more hard-edged building. Perhaps an early attempt at suggesting a kind of regional landscape, a connection, cliche though it may have become, a regional connection to the Palouse. But there were also a number of time-saving gadgets that were included to make more up-to-date lives for the women who were here, many of whom had not seen a new residence hall on campus for more than 50 years when this was built. The building actually won an award as one of the 5 best buildings built on any college campus that year, according to the Architectural Forum. And yet Regents Hill, which has this extraordinary little Japanese garden, is, or was anyway, targeted for demolition, according to a housing study that was completed for the university back in 2010. Now, the area around Regents Hill on the north side of campus, many of you are likely familiar with that area, has long been slated and had long been slated for facility upgrades, which ultimately did see the construction of 2 new dormitories that have been built in the last 10 years, Northside Residence Hall, Global Scholars, dorms that cost a lot of money, but were apparently much more up to date than Regents. The thing I kept hearing about when the new dorms were proposed is that students needed more electrical outlets. Here we see a couple of clips from that housing study. The schematic drawing there on the left shows Regents in the yellow circle there as it existed then and as it still exists now, fronting a parking lot, which is the green space that you see there. The plan to the right, which was estimated to be something that would happen in the 2020s, in this decade, shows Regents splintered into 6 different blocks. Regents Hill essentially vanishes. The accompanying narrative offered no real explanation as to why Regents should be eliminated or replaced, beyond the need to remove the parking lot in front. And maybe the consultants didn't have much information to go on, or they didn't have the time to look for it. Why didn't they look into its history? You can't just recommend the elimination of a building and say, I didn't have time. Any place of residence likely have memories, stories of the thousands, tens of thousands, in this case, those of the women who have lived and slept and eaten here over 70 years. All of us, we spend so much of our lives in our homes, in our places of residence. What would all the people who have ever lived in Regents say about this place if it was torn down? Has anyone asked them? Now, since that housing plan came out, I decided to take a little time to put some information together. I did some research and writing. I created the Wikipedia page for Regents Hill. You see that on the upper left. I put it on SAH Archipedia there on the upper right, a project I co-coordinated for the state of Washington. I included it on a website for WSU's Buildings and Landscapes there on the lower right. And the totality of this work led to the local newspaper, the Moscow Pullman Daily News, choosing to photograph the steps next to the Japanese garden and put it on their front page there on the lower left. And I'll keep speaking and writing about Regents' history and its potential for as long as anyone will listen. But I'm just a professor. I'm not the one writing the official reports. I'm not the design consultants being paid to do a housing plan or an environmental impact report or a programmatic design or any actual renderings. That's you. You can have that impact. You can ask first, can we save it? So, to wrap up, here's the manifesto again. And to repeat, I don't think I've said anything new, even if I might have gotten you to look or think about some older buildings in new ways, perhaps even considering that we can create energy-conscious, hopefully affordable housing out of existing buildings, and that we might consider doing so for modernist housing, exactly the type that we often tend to disregard. Now, getting into the specific ways that we might save it or adaptively reuse it, that's a topic for a different time. First, we just need to ask the question, can we save it? After that, I trust we'll make a good or at least a better decision, or at least one that we can more easily live with than if we had never asked the question at all. Thank you. I guess we have a little time for questions. Anybody? Questions? I think what happens, and you know this, I think many of us know this, is that when we think about integrity, the focus isn't on more intangible things. It's on something like structural integrity. So that's the general sense out there. If it doesn't have that integrity, we need to replace it. It's going to fall down. And we get that. But it goes back to that. It goes back to the materials, whether they're going to last, that kind of integrity. And so it's, on the one hand, it's really a matter of recognizing that integrity has so many different ways of coming at this. It's an awareness. It's an awareness piece. And I think that we are doing this with a lot of the preservation work that is going on now, whether it's physical or whether it's in writing, and talking about, speaking to marginalized communities and so on, and recognizing that there are other forms of integrity that are happening out there, and that we should take into account things such as memory of a space. And so that is happening. I think, though, we tend to, if we just in passing conversation, integrity sounds like something physical and structural. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it just snowballs. It's the same sort of sense of what we hear, what we think we know when we hear modernism, or when we look at buildings like this. Oh, and we rush at them with an aesthetic judgment. Oh, no, we don't want those. Let's remove these and put something else in its place. So that's my thought on that. Anna. And no, as far as I know, there aren't questions really about either, in this case, aesthetics or integrity, the sort of structural issues or decay or any of that. I was just there actually a couple of hours ago, and there's certainly some signs of decay but nothing that couldn't be maintained. Largely, I go back to some of these needs that and facility services would as well that students want. So this is in many ways a recruiting issue, which is understandable. What attracts students more, Regents Hill or Global Scholars or Northside? Now, Northside and Global Scholars cost more, but many people are willing to pay for it, and it might be, I go back to those electrical outlets, but also all the other amenities that come with that. Regents doesn't have as many of them, so it makes it more expendable. Would another, and I could see this from a recruiting perspective, from an administrative perspective, another building, for lack of a better term, great-looking building. I happen to think, obviously, Regents is great-looking and great in so many ways, but great-looking building fronting Colorado Street, in between Global Scholars and Northside, that's going to be another selling point. And it's going to have all the gadgets and gizmos that people want, and all the outdoor balconies, and all the big comfy furniture. So, still there, though. Yeah. No, it's a great question, and thank you for bringing that up. This absolutely is not a residential hall. This was a plant sciences building. It was built in the late 40s, or envisioned in the late 40s, early 50s, and it was just knocked down. It's gone. This was a facilities, in terms of research and labs and so on, need. Yeah, I mean, it's just another example of this kind of thing. I mean, the question by putting this up here, the question that I would, again, want people to consider is, again, can we save it? That could be the first thing. There was never any discussion, from anything that I heard anyway, you might have heard differently, about saving Johnson in that the Rollins complex, which was filled with all of these very high-tech buildings.
Dysfunctional. Capital planning does an evaluation, and I think we were involved in, how important is it that this building be saved? And this was on the low end. Healed is one that is going to be taken down. There is something, when you were talking about carbon and embodied carbon, Carpenter Hall was being considered to be demolished. I mean, that was very much part of the discussion about a new architecture school. And this is where you get into advocacy. People. There was a faculty member that way back then in the 90s, in the late 80s, did a carbon analysis of Carpenter Hall. And how incredibly disastrous it would be if they tore it down, and made such a compelling argument and got enough publicity that it was decided that it would be saved. Because the analysis of these old buildings is it's going to cost too much to bring them up to standard. You're talking about HVAC and the exiting out of that building. I mean, I don't know, is the cost of making it fire safe, all of these things. And they just said, well, it's just going to cost too much. But there was an advocate that was just relentless, and that's why that building is still there. So
And they renovated it, though. I mean, they added the 5th floor to Carpenter, and they gutted it, essentially.
There are still maybe some people living that are grumbling about, well, it just costs so much. They should have tore the damn thing down. It would have cost so much less to build a new building than to renovate the old building. But carbon and environmental impact was just not on the checklist as significant. This guy has been waving the flag. I mean, this issue of modernism, mid-century modernism now is getting more chic and more acceptable. When this guy was waving the flag for modernism, it was like, that ship has sailed. Nobody likes modernism anymore. And so he should be commended for being that forward thinking. Back when everyone thought he was a it was like, you need to take some different medication. Brutalism is, I just commend his continued efforts.
Thank you. Yeah. You heard it tonight. This was the beginning of the unlearning process of hating ugly, brutalist buildings. In all seriousness, great question. You know, this is not something that can happen overnight, like anything, right? It's a matter of awareness, and it's a matter of hearing this kind of thing over and over again. I mean, we now assume all of these issues of sustainability have been around forever. I mean, I was trying to indicate that they have been around, yes, indeed, forever. A lot longer than, just the last 20 years. But that had to start somewhere too, this awareness of how important it is to create energy-conscious construction, green buildings to help save our climate and our environment. And at first, back in the 70s, and then again with a big uptick in the 90s, there were not that many people that were on board. It's taken a whole series of things, not to mention the reality of what's happening to our climate, to make us all more aware. I'm not sure that saving modernist buildings is quite on that scale. This is just a little tiny piece of doing in many ways what I feel is what we can do, and not just faculty, but all of you, just recognize, hearing this, seeing it, for example, in your studio projects, if you're in studio, or if you're in construction management, what are the buildings that you're looking at? Why is it that what might be recommended is remove these buildings and build something new, if that's being asked, and you need to follow your professor's instructions, okay? Yes, you need to do that. But think about these kinds of things, right? Or ask the question. You could ask your professor, why are we removing these buildings? Many of you are like, I'm not going to do that. My grade's going to go down. I get that. I'm going to get in trouble here. I've got some faculty here sitting around glaring at me. Yeah, Zach. Okay, you've done something. You thought about it. That's all I'm asking. You thought about it. You came at that question thinking about this. And you may have chosen to go in a different direction, but you thought about it. And when you do that, it might change the entire conversation over time. Again, as I emphasize, we can't save everything. Some of these buildings, for whatever reason, may need to come down. They might. But thinking about it, that's what you did. Yeah, I mean, to get into the nuances of that, I actually don't think either of those are accurate in those assumptions. Not that you're saying them, but that is what is generally said. International style applies to any old building with a particular formula that could be plopped anywhere at any time. And it's vastly more complicated than that, and it took on different forms depending upon what parts of the world it went into and what political systems existed. You could look at the differences between the same type of building in, say, Soviet Russia, as opposed to parts of Latin America, as opposed to the United States. On the other hand, the questions of brutalism as light and shadow, I appreciate that perspective. It's not something I thought much about. My sort of personal experience and understanding predominantly of brutalism has a lot to do with buildings that were intentionally confrontational and exposing their materials and getting somewhat in your face, in part in reaction to the cultural climate. That's just one way, an additional way to look at it. So I think in either case, you have the need to do a more concentrated digging of why they were built, and your perceptions also being part of that, because many people agree with that sense. And so just understanding all of that. Well, when you start to combine all of this, it begins to become a kaleidoscope of different ideas and theories that we have tended to reduce to something like big and ugly. Let's demolish it. So, I mean, in that case, I always appreciate the conversation and the thinking, and I know you do a lot of it.
I mean, we're not going to knock down Louis Kahn, right?
I think some con buildings have been knocked down, in fact. I think so.
How about Paul Rudolph?
Some of his too, right? I might ask, why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we knock down a Louis Kahn? Why wouldn't we knock down a Le Corbusier, a Mies van der Rohe? Or why wouldn't we consider saving it? It's the same question. Why are we putting certain buildings up on a particular pedestal? If they may be having similar sorts of issues with climate and social disarray. Possibly. Yeah. I mean, you could begin to add to that, and I could take the other side of that equation as well. I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of cultural cachet that has grown up around particular designers who have been extraordinarily influential for one reason or another. And so then you could start to say, all right, these have significance for these reasons. They, of course, should be among the things that we look to save. But then the question becomes, we're talking about energy-conscious construction here, and which bleeds into all these questions of social and environmental justice. And when we're saving, we're looking to save, and I'm suggesting we should look, that's the first question we should ask in all cases. But if we're ultimately then going to make our decision on what we save based upon something such as what you bring up, it's another kind of a question, right? So that's something that we need to consider. Yeah. Are you talking about the average people who are not average? All of us.
The climate of society, as regards this question.
I guess I'm trying to figure out, do you think it's a bad thing to ask that question? Yeah, I think this is a great point. I mean, from my experience, and others may have different experiences, but when you go and you talk to people, say outside of this room, about the world of design and construction, they don't necessarily know what we're talking about. And we're not necessarily in the majority here in the world of design and construction. I'd like to think maybe we are, but you go outside. I was just talking to a colleague of mine who lives on, as one example of this, there's a street in Pullman called Mies. And he called it Mies. He's like, I live on Mies, and I've been living on Mies for 2 years. And I said, well, I think it's called Mies because it's named after Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. There's Alvar Street, which is right next to it, which was named after Alvar Aalto. So there was a developer, I think, at some point that was interested in these designers. The point being is that he's a professor. I won't mention names. And he's in the history department. I won't mention names. I won't. He's a really good friend of mine. I had no idea who Ludwig Mies van der Rohe was. No clue. He's an historian, he's a PhD. That's just one example. That's an academic. You go out on the street. So your point is well taken. You know, if you lead with questions about design, issues of design, and about questions of how the light captures this or that, or the aesthetics of something, or the fame of the particular designer, often people will tune out. Not the architectural or design community. For them, it will be up here. But again, if you're talking about advocating to save a building that people can't live in because it was designed by someone who many of us hold dear, that doesn't generally have a lot of cachet. It did, and it's still a criteria for historic preservation. It's criteria B. For important people who are involved in a building, this could be a reason for a building to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. But it's not the only criteria. And I'm seeing the emphasis of those criteria shifting over time. And we're spending a lot more time looking at ideas outside of the famous people. I appreciate you all asking questions and sticking around. Thank you.